Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kraft, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 14 tight end and quarterback rankings for the 2024 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to these two positions, beginning with matchups and transitioning into my top 16 rankings. If you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, travel down to the description. There are timestamps available there, like in every single video. Also, while you're down in the description, if you have not yet already, subscribe to the channel and, of course, click the bell notification button, because besides the daily content, we're also live streaming every single day here on the channel. For those of you who have any questions, later tonight after the Green Bay Packers take on the Detroit Lions, I will be live streaming here on the channel. So if you have any Week 14 lineup questions, or potentially are preparing for the fantasy football playoffs and have any questions regarding Weeks 15 through 17, I'm more than happy to help. Be sure to swing on by. Thank you very much. Also, at the end of today's video, I will be putting together a couple entries via Underdog. So if you guys are interested in that, it'll be at the end of the episode. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin by talking about tight end matchups going into Week 14. Now, again, based on statistics allowed from weeks 6 through 13 in terms of receiving statistics, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, we have found that the Raiders, Panthers, Bengals, Buccaneers, Jaguars, etc. are the most advantageous matchups at the tight end position. All those teams I just mentioned allowing over 15 fantasy points per game on average to opposing tight ends since week 6. So, of course, we want to take advantage of these matchups. So, as I continue on with today's episode and we talk about tight ends in specific, if in fact they are taking on said matchups, for example, Cade Otton taking on the Raiders, that's an incredibly advantageous matchup, and another reason as to why we would start him going into the week, based on the fact that that defense cannot cover tight ends and his continued usage within his own offense. Again, just wanted to go ahead and present some of the more advantageous matchups. We'll go ahead and dig deeper into the overall conversation as we continue, but I also want to go ahead and present some of the more disadvantageous matchups. For example, Detroit Lions, Giants, Chargers, Saints, etc. Again, the Detroit Lions have stopped almost every tight end. We'll talk about this in an extension when we talk about Tucker Kraft later today. I still believe that Tucker Kraft is a startable option, but again, thus far this season, outside of a singular game against the Seahawks, in which a tight end has scored a touchdown against the Detroit Lions, not a single group of tight ends within a singular team has scored over 10 fantasy points against the Detroit Lions within a single game this season. So again, there is not a lot of upside unless Tucker Kraft is going to be able to find himself within the end zone this week. All right, with this all covered, let me go ahead and remind you again, like we mentioned earlier at the end of today's episode, I will be putting together a couple entries via Underdog. But for those of you who are trying to potentially tail those picks and get my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, be sure to check out the link down in the description. When you sign up today using code Andrew and make that first time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to be able to claim the first time deposit offer, but get my rankings every single Sunday morning from my email directly to yours. Half PPR, full PPR, flex rankings, by position, by tier, all-encompassing rankings in order to help you guys succeed every single Sunday. So for those of you who are trying to take advantage of the overall opportunity and, of course, tail tonight's picks, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. If, in fact, you're not eligible based on your current location, or if you've perhaps used my code or somebody else's code in the past, you can always check out the Patreon. Rankings are available there and unlimited questions answered. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's get into the tight end conversation, beginning with our number one, Brock Bowers. It is a no-brainer. Brock Bowers coming off of another incredible week. 14 targets, 10 catches, 140 and a touchdown, 25 fantasy points. Since the Raiders have changed their offensive coordinator, the target counts for Brock Bowers have consisted of 16, 10, and 14. I mean, this most recent performance with Aiden O'Connell at quarterback, 14 targets on 35 passing attempts, a 40% target share within the offense. He takes on the Buccaneers, which is the fourth best matchup at the position. We would anticipate for Brock Bowers to continue his streak of success this week. Moving on to our number two, we have Trey McBride. Speaking of an incredibly high target share, over the course of the last two games, Trey McBride has been exposed to 27 total targets. Again, that's a 33% target share within his offense, and now has another opportunity of taking on the Seattle Seahawks, who he had a privilege of taking on back in Week 12. In that game, Trey McBride, 15 targets, 12 catches, 133, and 19.3 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. We would assume that he could potentially pick up exactly where he left off, considering the Seahawks are allowing nearly 11 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and Trey McBride is one of the best in the league as the number one receiving threat of the Arizona Cardinals offense. Number three, we have the thumbnail of today's episode, or one of the thumbnails. We have Jonnu Smith taking on the New York Jets. Look, the fact of the matter is, over the course of the last 3 consecutive games, he has put up 16 or more fantasy points every single time out. He's been able to maintain a 25% target share within this competitive offense, where you have guys like Devon Achane, Tyreek Hill, and Jalen Waddle. Jonnu Smith is a mainstay and is going to continue to ball out. Based on his most recent performances, he is currently the number 5 overall tight end in fantasy football. My preseason prediction has somehow come to light. Jonnu Smith has saved the day with his recent production over the course of the last 3 games, getting himself 159 total yards after the catch. 53% of his total yards over the course of the last 3 weeks after the catch. He's a dynamic receiver that is going to continue to ball out. All they have to do is get the ball in his direction. He's going to continue to be a stud. If it wasn't for the fact that the pass got deflected and landed in the hands of Tyreek Hill, that touchdown was intended for Jonnu Smith late in the game against the Green Bay Packers. He continues to get himself a lot of exposure to opportunity within the red zone. He's absolutely, in my mind, a must start going forward. Moving on to our number 4, we have George Kittle, who honestly should be in the S tier, but I wanted to go ahead and balance it out a little bit. Look, the fact of the matter is George Kittle thus far this season, prior to the snow game on Sunday against the Buffalo Bills, was on an 8-game streak of 12-plus fantasy points, and I anticipate for him to get back on track, scoring 12-plus fantasy points going forward because of the touchdown upside he will be exposed to. Again, he takes on the Bears this week, the 10th best matchup at the position. They're allowing 11.67 fantasy points per game in a half PPR to opposing tight ends. The most recent performances against the Bears: New England tight ends combined for 4 catches, 78. Minnesota, 8 catches, 121. And most recently, Sam LaPorta, of course, with his efforts, scoring 2 touchdowns against the Bears as of late. Moving on to our number 5, we have Travis Kelce, another auto start. Again, as of late, the biggest concern regarding Travis Kelce hasn't really been his total targets, but it's rather been Noah Gray's overall contributions within this offense. Noah Gray, over the course of the last 3 games, has 15 targets, 12 receptions, 147 receiving yards, and 4 receiving touchdowns, which is certainly impacting the overall upside of Travis Kelce. But he has himself an incredible track record against the Los Angeles Chargers. Over the course of his career, the last 3 games against this defense has consisted of 85 or more receiving yards. I'd anticipate for Travis Kelce to get back on track, taking on this defense earlier this season, had himself 9 targets, 7 catches, 89, 12.4 fantasy points. As long as he's able to find himself in the end zone, the S tier is not out of the realm of possibility. Moving on to our number 6, we have David Njoku. Speaking of finding the end zone, David Njoku this most recent week, 2 receiving touchdowns, 9 receptions, 17 targets, a career high and season high of 17 targets, a ridiculous number, and now has an opportunity of taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers, who they played back in week 12. In that game, a snow game, the snow globe game as we all remember, unfortunately did drop a touchdown, but did only come away with 5 targets, 1 catch, and 9 receiving yards. Did end up getting himself a 2-point conversion. Multiple times while they're in the red zone, we have seen David Njoku highly utilized. So going forward, we're going to continue to expect him to be the primary threat down in the red zone, and in those circumstances, get himself a lot of opportunity, especially against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who cannot cover opposing tight ends. As of late, Baltimore tight ends, 6 catches, 97. Cleveland tight ends, 5 catches for 67, even in that game most recently in the Snow Globe game. And then Cincinnati Bengals tight ends, 11 catches for 89. I'd anticipate David Njoku to continue his streak of success this week. Moving on to our number 7, we have Cade Otton, who takes on the Las Vegas Raiders, the best matchup at the position, 17.46 fantasy points per game allowed since week 6. Kansas City tight ends recently, 11 catches for 128. Miami, 9 for 132 and 2 touchdowns. Cincinnati, 13 catches, 152, 2 touchdowns. We have seen many of tight ends dominate against the Las Vegas Raiders. Cade Otton is the next man up. He could have easily scored a touchdown last week if it wasn't for the primary coverage of J.C. Horn making a play on the ball. Moving on to our number 8. We have Evan Engram. Look, the fact of the matter is, Evan Engram has played incredibly well over the course of his career. And even with Mac Jones taking over the helm of the starting quarterback position, now that Trevor Lawrence has been placed on the injured reserve, I truly do believe that Evan Engram is going to be exposed to a healthy volume of opportunity. The last 3 games with Mac Jones, 8, 8, and 7 targets. 28% target share to be exact. But this most recent game, in less than 2.5 quarters of play, honestly, we could just categorize it as 2 quarters of play. He was able to get himself 8 targets with Mac Jones. So if we're going to be in a situation going into this week in which they may be in a negative game script taking on the Tennessee Titans, the 12th best matchup at the position, allowing over 11 fantasy points per game. We have seen this defense allow 38 yards and a touchdown to Washington tight ends, 46 yards and a touchdown to Houston tight ends. Hopefully Evan Engram will be implicated for a healthy volume of opportunity, which will lead to receptions, receiving yards, and maybe the occasional touchdown. Moving on to our number 9, we have Jake Ferguson. Now, this is purely under the assumption that he's healthy and ready to go this week and completely clears the concussion protocol, which has been plaguing him over the last 2 weeks. Now, the reason why I feel so confident about Jake Ferguson is not only the matchup against the Bengals, which is the 3rd best at the position, allowing 15.44 fantasy points per game. We have seen the following performances against the Bengals as of late. Las Vegas tight ends, 7 for 67 and a touchdown. Baltimore, 7 for 72 and a touchdown. Los Angeles, 5 for 86 and a touchdown. And Pittsburgh, 9 for 99 and a touchdown. We have seen the last 4 consecutive games against Cincinnati Bengals, tight ends accumulate over 65 yards and a touchdown minimum. Therefore, Jake Ferguson, hopefully with the opportunity share going in his direction, should be fantastic. In the last 3 games, weeks 11 through 13, tight ends of the Dallas Cowboys with Cooper Rush are averaging 9.3 targets per game, which is leading to 7 receptions, 74 receiving yards, 0.33 receiving touchdowns, and 12.87 fantasy points per game. If somehow, some way, Jake Ferguson was dropped in your league because of the concussion protocol he has been on as of late, he's an automatic pickup and play going into this week. Moving on to our number 10, we have TJ Hockenson, who has his ebbs and flows. He has inconsistency of play based on a lack of opportunity. In the last 2 games in which we have seen him get 9 targets, he's put up 114 and 72 receiving yards in those respective games. In the last couple games in which he doesn't get 9 targets, most recently a game of 6 targets, 3 catches, 28 receiving yards. It's purely just going to be a matter of, is he going to be exposed to opportunity? Most recently, the Atlanta Falcons have allowed the following statistics to opposing tight ends. Seattle, 5 catches for 70. Tampa Bay, 12 for 110 and 2 touchdowns. Dallas, 7 for 71. There is a possibility in which TJ Hockenson could be highly implicated for usage this week, but considering how bad the Atlanta Falcons secondary has been against opposing wide receivers, I would expect this to primarily be a day in which Justin Jefferson succeeds, and then after that, if TJ Hockenson is able to pick up the scraps, hopefully he's able to do so. Moving on to our number 11. We have Sam LaPorta, who has himself an incredible matchup taking on the Packers, the 9th best matchup at the position. This defense allowing over 12 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. We've most recently seen Jacksonville, 9 for 95 and a touchdown. San Francisco, 6 for 82 and a touchdown. And most recently on Thursday, Thanksgiving, Jonnu Smith and the tight ends of that team combined for 12 catches, 126. Sam LaPorta is implicated for a lot of opportunity today if, in fact, the Detroit Lions and Jared Goff deem him to be exposed to said opportunity. The fact of the matter is he doesn't get himself a high enough target share and is purely dependent on receiving touchdowns. Now, luckily for Sam LaPorta, he has scored 5 receiving touchdowns in the last 7 games, which obviously is going to continue to benefit him. But scoring 5 receiving touchdowns on his last 19 receptions, again, that's 1 out of every 4 receptions being a touchdown. Hopefully he gets, at least 4 receptions today, so one of them could end up being a touchdown on the average basis. Moving on, we have our number 12. We have Pat Freiermuth, who's over the course of the last 2 weeks got himself more and more opportunity with Russell Wilson. The last 2 weeks in specific being his season high targets with Russell Wilson, coming off of most recent performance of 7 targets, 6 catches, 68 in a touchdown. Washington, the backup tight end of this offense, has gotten himself enough utilization to almost nullify Pat Freiermuth at times. But this most recent game, of course, found himself a lot of success. And even back in week 12 against the Cleveland Browns, who he will be taking on this week, had himself 4 receptions for 59 yards and 7.9 fantasy points. If we're going to be in a situation very similar to this, in which he is exposed to a high volume of opportunity against Cleveland, in a game in which it's not snowing and it's a controlled environment, hopefully Pat Freiermuth will be exposed to even more opportunity share with Russell Wilson this week. Moving on to our number 13, we have Tucker Kraft. Now, I mentioned this earlier. This is by far and away the most difficult matchup at the tight end position. As of thus far this season, outside of the Seattle Seahawks tight end scoring 14 total points as a group, the other performances of tight end groups against the Detroit Lions this season, the highest point totals are 8.8, 7.2, 6.7 twice, 5.6, and 5.4. So typically, unless you score a touchdown against the Detroit Lions, you are not going to get anywhere nearly close to 10 fantasy points with your receptions and receiving yards. But luckily for Tucker Kraft, he has scored 10 plus fantasy points in 6 of the last 9 games he has played, primarily because of his receiving touchdown upside. Hopefully he'll continue to be exposed to that overall opportunity share, and when he is, should be a solid play. But otherwise, these safeties have played incredibly well in terms of coverage against the tight end position thus far this season. All right, moving on to our number 14, we have Juwan Johnson. Now, again, going into this week, it is also one of the toughest matchups at the position, but the fact of the matter is, with Taysom Hill having sustained his season-ending injury, it opens up the door for Juwan Johnson to get back into this top 16 conversation with a healthy volume of opportunity. Since Derek Carr's return in the last 4 games, the tight end position for the New Orleans Saints has been averaging 11 targets per game, 8 receptions, 82 yards, and a half a touchdown per game. Hopefully, Juwan Johnson is going to be inheriting the vast majority of that going into this week. Moving on to our number 15, we have Kyle Pitts. We haven't given up yet. Now, again, taking on the Minnesota Vikings could be a matchup that we want to take advantage of, primarily because of the experiences that tight ends have had against the Minnesota Vikings as of late. Jacksonville tight ends, 10 catches for 81. Chicago tight ends, specifically, this being Cole Kmet, 7 for 64. And then most recently, the Arizona Cardinals tight ends combined for 15 catches and 128 receiving yards last week. Therefore, Kyle Pitts could be given a range of opportunity that is far greater than what he has been exposed to as of late, primarily because Raheem Morris, the head coach of the team, has been asked, do you like the overall utilization and lack of, overall production from Kyle Pitts? And he said, I would like to see him get more opportunities going forward. And if, in fact, Kirk Cousins is going to have himself his successful revenge game, it would entail Kyle Pitts stepping up. Moving on to our number 16, we have Will Dissly, who's been quite a disappointing performer as late, very similar to Kyle Pitts. Again, they do take on the Chiefs, the 8th best matchup at the position. Tampa Bay tight ends, Buffalo tight ends, Carolina tight ends, and Las Vegas tight ends all performing against them. Hopefully, Will Dissly will be given the opportunity he deserves to be relevant within the given week. Again, this most recent performance, the Los Angeles Chargers only threw the ball 23 times. I'd expect them to throw the ball far more and look in the direction of their number 1 tight end, Will Dissly. Now, again, for those of you who are looking for Dallas Goedert and or Dalton Kincaid, until I get 100% status as to whether or not they are playing, I'm not going to rank them. I'll talk about them later this week on Sunday morning's rankings. Again, like we do every single Sunday morning, we are live here on the channel at 7 a.m. So if you guys have any questions regarding our top 16 updated rankings, they will be available there on screen this upcoming Sunday morning. Thank you very much. Okay, let's move on to the quarterback conversation for weeks 6 through 13. We find that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Jaguars, Falcons, Bengals, Browns, Patriots, etc. are the most advantageous matchups at the quarterback position, but every single team on this page, whether you are the Buccaneers or the Chiefs on the bottom, you want to take advantage of these matchups. We've seen a fair share of fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks by all of these defenses. Therefore, we're not going to go ahead and avoid any of these upcoming matchups. The only matchups we would potentially anticipate avoiding is quarterbacks against the Eagles or potentially even the 49ers, Lions, Steelers. But again, even when we talk about these matchups, Jameis Winston against the Steelers should be expected to play well. We have, Caleb Williams, who's coming off of 2 fantastic games against the 49ers, and then Jordan Love taking on the Lions. Even though these are difficult matchups, they are the best quarterbacks, and they will be mentioned on today's episode, and we'll go into more detail regarding why I believe they will find success despite the fact that they have these difficult matchups. Okay, let's get into our top 16 quarterback rankings, beginning with our number 1. We have, of course, the one and only Josh Allen, who's coming off of a legendary performance in a terrible weather game. When Josh Allen is capable of completing a passing touchdown and a receiving touchdown in the same play, his legend continues to grow, coming off of a game in which he had only 13 passing completions, but 28.4 fantasy points. Again, this week, they take on the LA Rams, an advantageous matchup, indoors in SoFi. No weather impact we would anticipate with the potential return of Keon Coleman, Dalton Kincaid, more rapport being built with Amari Cooper for Josh Allen to continue his streak of success this week. Number 2. We have Joe Burrow, who is playing absolutely out of his mind. This is 4 consecutive games in which he has 3 or more passing touchdowns. Again, the Bengals offense over the course of the last 4 games has scored 41, 34, 27, and 38 points. And they continue to lose games primarily because this Bengals defense cannot stop a soul. The Bengals defense having given up 24, 35, 34, and 44 points in the last 4 games. If we're going to continue to be in situations in which the Bengals defense cannot stop a soul, this week in specific taking on the Dallas Cowboys, expect for Joe Burrow to continue to have to air it out and find himself this kind of level of success every single week. Moving on to our number 3. Oops, I guess I have both of them on screen. Either way, let's talk about our number 3 first and foremost. We have Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts with his rushing upside, again, always gives him the potential of being a top 3 prospect for fantasy purposes. The fact of the matter is taking on the Carolina Panthers is an advantageous matchup at the running back position. So hopefully Saquon Barkley does not run away with all the fantasy points and Jalen Hurts will still be exposed to more. Now, going into this week, most likely the absence of Dallas Goedert is expected, but we should get Devontae Smith back, which hopefully elevates the overall potential for upside for Jalen Hurts in this circumstance. Otherwise, an auto start, as we all know, based on his rushing upside every single week. Then we move on to our number 4. We have Sam Darnold. Look, to begin the A tier, Sam Darnold has been highly consistent as of late, scoring 2+ touchdowns in 5 of the last 6 games. As long as he continues this successful streak, taking on the Atlanta Falcons this week, who have given up 2+ touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks in 9 of the last 11 games, we would assume that Sam Darnold should be able to have himself a fantastic week here. The Falcons thus far this season are the 3rd best matchup at the position, allowing 17.31 fantasy points per game and a 70% passing completion percentage to opposing quarterbacks. Sam Darnold should have himself a lot of success this week. Moving on to our number 5, we have Tua Tagovailoa, the other thumbnail of today's episode. Coming off of a week in which he had a 80% passing completion percentage, 365 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns in a cold weather game. Since returning in week 8, he has had a 77.31% passing completion percentage. He is dominating over the course of the last 3 games, averaging 40 passing attempts per game on average, primarily because the Dolphins running backs are averaging only 3.09 yards per carry in the last 3 games. If this rushing attack continues to falter, expect for Tua Tagovailoa to continue to carry this team with his arm, which he has done as of late. Moving on to our number 6, we have Brock Purdy. Look, Brock Purdy, I understand the last week's performance, quite underwhelming, but nobody should have started him in that weather-concerned game, on top of the fact that he was dealing with a shoulder. Now, going into this week, we have to understand that prior to the snow game, Brock Purdy was coming off of 5 consecutive games of 17+ fantasy points for fantasy purposes. So if we're going to be in a situation in which he's going to continue to get himself his rushing upside, which has primarily led to that 17 plus fantasy point production. He's been averaging 7.98 fantasy points per game from rushing statistics over the course of the last 5 games. He's been able to score 2+ touchdowns minimum in each of those last 5 games. And the Bears defense have allowed 2+ touchdowns to each of the last 3 quarterbacks they have taken on. I'd anticipate Brock Purdy to step up and ball out in the absence of Christian McCaffrey this week. Number 7, we have Baker Mayfield. Look, the fact of the matter is he's coming off of his worst game of the season, and that's as bad as it's going to get. 10.2 fantasy points, turnovers for days. But going into this week, I'm anticipating a bounce-back performance taking on the Raiders. Again, the Raiders allowing 16.17 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Again, a top 10 matchup at the position. We would anticipate that Baker Mayfield, with the potential talent that surrounds him, to step up to the task on hand. I just hope that the Las Vegas Raiders offense is competitive enough to continue to push Baker Mayfield to scoring even more fantasy points by the end of this week. Moving on to the B tier, we begin with Kyler Murray. Look, the fact of the matter is, Kyler Murray, when he gets his rushing upside implicated, very similar to last week, 7 carries for 48 yards, he is going to be highly relevant. Sure, he turned over the ball twice last week, but that is a kind of uncommon situation with Kyler as of late over the course of the season. Doesn't really turn over the ball very often, but over the course of the season, when he gets rushing, he finds himself a lot of success. Going into this week, I would anticipate Kyler Murray to get himself a lot of potential yardage through the air, as he has been able to eclipse 260 yards in 4 of the last 5 games, and taking on the Seattle Seahawks at home should be a far greater overall potential for upside in comparison to the last time these two teams took each other on. Moving on to our number 9. We have Russell Wilson. Look, Russell Wilson has played incredibly well as of late, coming off of a most recent performance of 414 yards, 3 passing touchdowns, completing passes to 10 different receiving options, and now takes on the Cleveland Browns, who back in Week 12, when he took them on in that Snow Globe game, had a 75% passing completion percentage, 270 yards, and a passing touchdown. If you can accomplish that in the Snow game, I would only imagine that 270 yards, 2 passing touchdowns at a base minimum is expected against the 5th best matchup at the quarterback position, taking on the Browns. Number 10, we have Jordan Love. Look, the fact of the matter is, Jordan Love has been highly consistent, and over the course of his entire career, when we have talked about the last 2 seasons, Jordan Love, about 80% of the time, is scoring 2 or more touchdowns on a per-week basis. There are going to be instances at time in which he doesn't score 2 touchdowns. For example, earlier this season against the Detroit Lions, in that weather game in Green Bay, wasn't able to score 2 touchdowns. But going into tonight's game, considering the injuries that have taken place to the defense of the Detroit Lions, specifically their defensive line, once the rushing attack is going to be implemented, it is going to open up the play action opportunities for Jordan Love, and he is expected to score 2 touchdowns at a base minimum going into tonight's game. Again, this is going to be a potential high-scoring event. Based on a total set by Vegas, this is implicated to be one of the highest-scoring events of the week. We're hoping for that to be the case. Moving on to number 11, we have Caleb Williams. Look, Caleb Williams has been incredible as of late, having thrown 86 total passing attempts in the last 2 games and 2 touchdowns minimum in each of the last 2 games, on top of the fact that in the last 3 games, he has totaled 142 rushing yards. As long as the passing game, the rushing upside is all going to be implicated, on top of the fact that this is most likely going to be a guaranteed negative game script taking on the San Francisco 49ers. I'm not afraid of Caleb Williams turning over the ball. He hasn't done so very much thus far this season. Now that I mentioned it, I probably just jinxed it. Probably going to be a tipped pass to an interception on the first play. But going into this week, I would anticipate Caleb Williams to continue a successful streak, especially with the coach firing. It typically gives the team the boost to get themselves even more upside within the upcoming performance. Moving on to our number 12, we have Jared Goff. Look, the fact of the matter is, Jared Goff on any given week could disappear, but he has had himself 2+ touchdowns in 8 of the last 10 games. But when I say he could potentially disappear, this could very easily be a game in which he scores 1 touchdown, and then there's 4 touchdowns to the combination of Gibbs and potentially David Montgomery. So if in fact that's going to take place, hopefully it's not, we wouldn't be surprised. Last time out against the Green Bay Packers, he had himself an 82% passing completion percentage in a rain game. Again, Jared Goff has played out of his mind thus far this season. I would anticipate for him to continue to do so this week. Moving on to our number 13, we have Patrick Mahomes, who thus far this season has more points than Jared Goff for fantasy purposes, which was quite the surprise, but takes on the Los Angeles Chargers. Again, this most recent performance, the Los Angeles Chargers had themselves 4 interceptions. I wouldn't expect them to be that solid of a defense. Obviously, Kirk Cousins got very cute with it last week. Watching that game back, I mean, he's throwing the ball into quadruple coverage. So going into this week, I would anticipate the Chargers defense sure to be solid, but I would expect Patrick Mahomes to be able to get himself his 250, 2 passing touchdowns under the assumption they don't continue to default when they get close to the goal line and, of course, have to settle for field goals. Moving on to our number 14, speaking of the Chargers, we have Justin Herbert. This should be a competitive back and forth game. And even though Justin Herbert's coming off of his most recent performance of only 16 completions on 23 attempts and only 147 passing yards, again, no touchdown scored last week. It was all field goals and defensive touchdowns for this team. He did end up getting a 2-point conversion, but purely this Kansas City defense cannot stop opposing quarterbacks. They've allowed 2+ touchdowns to 7 of the last 8 quarterbacks they have faced. Therefore, I would anticipate Justin Herbert to get back on track this week, especially considering the lack of a running game that they have possessed as of late. Moving on to our number 15, we have Jameis Winston. Look, the fact of the matter is he's either going to score 20+ fantasy points or he's going to score you 10 fantasy points. One of those two situations is going to transpire. He's either going to ball out or he's going to kill your fantasy week. You have to decide at the end of the day whether you want to potentially live or die by the Jameis Winston blade. Moving on to our number 16 to close out today's video at the quarterback conversation, we have Will Levis, who has had himself 2+ passing touchdowns in 3 of the last 4 games. And in those last 4 games, a 62% passing completion percentage and only 66 rushing yards. Hasn't been the cleanest quarterback, but luckily takes on the second best matchup at the quarterback position, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, who are allowing 71% passing completion percentage and 17.5 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Without Trevor Lawrence out there, I would anticipate Will Levis to potentially have himself a couple extra opportunities once Mac Jones and this Jacksonville Jaguars offense continues to punt the ball in his direction. Of course, hopefully leading to touchdown upside with guys like Ridley Pollard and, of course, Westbrook Ikine, who has a nose for the end zone. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to my top 16 quarterback and tight end rankings. Let's close out today's video by talking about a couple entries via Underdog going into tonight's game. So going into tonight's game, I have 2 specific plays that I've entered, okay? So as it currently stands, this is one right here that I made last night. It entails Jahmyr Gibbs going over 59.5 rushing yards. He has accomplished this in 11 of the last 11 games. I have David Montgomery going over 59.5 rushing yards. Even though he wasn't able to accomplish it this most recent week, he has gone over 90 total yards in 6 of the last 6 games he has played. But not only that, 3 defensive linemen for the Detroit Lions are missing tonight. So if this opens up even more potential for rushing opportunity, Josh Jacobs should be able to eclipse this. And of course, David Montgomery scoring touchdowns is a typical thing. But this overall entry is a $10 entry. That's going to get 31.2 back. This is the entry that I put majority of my money on, a $100 entry, mostly because this has been something that only just recently I'm aware of. Receptions in the first quarter being a statistic that you can potentially put an entry on is something that I'm more than interested in doing. Therefore, I did so at a pretty high capacity. So we have Jayden Reed going higher than 0.5 receptions in the first quarter. He has accomplished this exact number 11 of the last 12 games. He's averaging 1.5 receptions per game in the first quarter. Then we have Amon-Ra St. Brown going higher. He has had himself a higher number than 0.5 in 11 of the last 12 games as well, averaging 1.75 receptions in the first quarter. And then David Montgomery has surpassed his number of 4.5 rushing yards in the first quarter in 11 of the last 12 games. He is averaging 24 rushing yards in the first quarter of games thus far this season. All 3 of these players have succeeded on this number 11 of the last 12 games. Therefore, I am putting a $100 entry on it to make 206. I'm trying to quite literally flip my overall entry here within the given week, and that's why I'm tailing this. I probably go ahead and potentially put up more plays in regards to this. Potentially taking, anytime reception here with a Jahmyr Gibbs, because maybe I want to kind of increase the overall potential of the multiplier. Either way, you could check out Underdog today using the link down in the description, using code Andrew and making that first time deposit minimum of $10. Not only will you get the deposit match, you'll also get the first time deposit offer, in which you can get the free play, get my rankings every Sunday, and of course, tail the upcoming plays. All right, that's going to cover it. I'll be back later tonight after the game between the Packers and the Lions. Hopefully an exciting one. Until next time, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.